Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Rob Carey, president of Cloudera Government Solutions. Rob, good to have you with us today.
Thanks, Tom. Good to see you.
Let's talk about something that you have laid out from the Cloudera standpoint, and that is the idea of a holistic data strategy as something almost as a requisite to having a sound cloud strategy. What do you mean by holistic data strategy, and how does it relate to cloud?
Tom, it's an interesting look that we've been struggling with. We, the DoD, the government, for many years, is how do I take all these pieces of data and enable myself to migrate from the legacy compute storage platform to the modern cloud-based compute storage platform. So, what I think that the requirement here is to really dig deep into and understand format, taxonomy, structure. How do I collect it? How do I secure it? There's many attributes that are aimed at the data, so that when you migrate to cloud, you actually have a way to go back and touch this data as required. And one of the things I'd like to say is, command of the data is command of your mission. So if you can't get your arms around the data that you have, it's very difficult to render decisions for your department or agency.
And so the implication is that whereas most people think the difficulty will be putting the application logic of legacy systems, for example, in the cloud, you really need to think about how the data itself will migrate just as much.
Absolutely, it's both. When I was CIO and back with Dave Runegard and Dan Porter, we started this application rationalization process in Navy, but it was really aimed at and uncovered this data problem. Many applications were producing duplicative data. You had to then identify the authoritative data. We don't use that term anymore, but at the end of the day, you had to figure out which am I counting here? Which is the data that I'm now going to render decisions off of, and is my baseline information, so that as I move forward, I have the facts.
And there's also, I imagine, the matter of economy here because you don't want to just use the cloud as a giant storage shed. You want to weed out what is not what you might have called authoritative or useful or something needed going forward before you load it all up in the cloud.
That's correct, Tom. The you do not want to just move everything into the cloud. You want to actually have your sieve out there, and a way to organize and manage and then provide the necessary accesses and security to that stuff that you want to hold on to, that is your future. I'm not saying that everything goes away, but clearly what goes into the cloud is the things that you believe will inform your future.
And in developing that holistic data strategy, what are the most important elements of it that agencies need to think about?
So you want to look at data from attributes. Am I going to collect it once and use it many times? So I'm going to serve up that authoritative data. Am I going to be able to secure it? Am I going to be able to provide role-based access to it if that's required? Will I be able to understand which applications engage the data, right? And so there's so many facets that are at play here as you move forward. That's why this holistic approach at data is the element that must be configured. And then you can work your way out to the applications, and then you can work your way to what of that migrates to the cloud.
It sounds like you almost need a checkbook or a checklist approach rather to go at the whole data strategy question.
There is a sequential set of events that I believe, ordered in a certain way, will give you that most efficient use of the resource, the data that you have. Because remember, data is useful in context, which means it's now information that I can use to render a decision.
And should you do this checklist and this data strategy in conjunction with the potential cloud suppliers? Because would they have services that might be able to help you rationalize your data in that manner?
Yes, and there are many tools like the ones Cloudera produced that actually enable the ability to move data from ingest to analysis and give you that holistic view of it from the beginning, from sucking it into now I'm using it, right? Because I have it, and now I can have it in use, and that's an important thing, to have coherency across that continuum.
And I imagine it's also important to have a strategy for how the data will be analyzed because you want to minimize the cost of constantly downloading it and uploading it again, too.
You want to understand what is the intended use of the data, but not preclude an unintended use of the data as you move forward, because that's what cloud computing will let you do. Is there's some flexibility there in being able to do different things with the data AI and ML allow us to then analyze the data more times than we can shake a stick at to get at facets of the answer that we didn't think that we could previously get at.
And for the Defense Department, which might find itself in a suddenly dynamic situation at any time, how do you know what sources of data should be part of this ingestion, part of this holistic strategy? Because sometimes you don't know what you need and you don't know what you won't know in a dynamic situation.
That's right. And Tom, as you know, that they've all created chief data officers now, and in conjunction with the CIOs and the CISOs, moving this mass into the future compute storage state of cloud. They have to come up with their own rubric of what's important to them, and then identify it, tag it, and then create the methodologies to utilize it on an enterprise scale, on a smaller scale, or maybe on a local scale.
And speaking of chief data officers, which, as you mentioned, DoD and all the civilian agencies, I think by statute have to have and have to have ingest them so that they can start ingesting the data in the right way. What types of insights do you think people need to expect from data? Or maybe put it this way, you, is it important to have a sense of what it is you want from the data before you go through the holistic data strategy? Because the strategy should support what it is you hope to get out of the data.
Correct. Well, I mean, go back to your mission. Could be the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, Space Force. Your mission should dictate what you need to be rendering decisions from. So then you can walk your way back, I think, back to the data from your overall mission and strategy. And at that point, you can decide I have too much, too little, because the algorithms and the tools that exist today enable us to sort of run dry runs on, and then note, is my data giving me about what I think, not even close to what I think, or right on what I'm thinking. So now I can run excursions. I can do lots of things with the data with the tools that exist today that I couldn't do 15 years ago, even 10 years ago. So I think you start with your mission, work your way back, and then you can determine which data is relevant to those decisions you think you need to make and the ones you know you need to make.
And what challenges do you find agencies have, especially when migrating the legacy data? Because very often it's connected to an old application or old logic, or in the case of DoD, sometimes to really old languages. And so you've got some exotic formats, but nevertheless, it may offer insight into logistics, maintenance, whatever in the future.
I think finding it, Tom, is really, and I say that somewhat tongue in cheek, but literally identifying where is it, who's maintaining it, right? Is it accurate, determining its efficacy in place, and then how do I move this legacy data forward, or can I move this legacy data forward? So that these are the decisions that I believe the chief data officers are probably coming up to more times than they would like. Anything that's been created in the last 4 or 5 years is ready to go to the cloud. Anything was created in the early 2000s, in the 1990s, you're really going to have to stare hard at to decide what you do with it.
I imagine there are services that take, say, ADA application data or jovial application data. And if you've been in
You're
military, you
dating
know what I'm
yourself.
talking about. And can it be in some way encapsulated, or can there be metadata applied to it such that it's useful without a big expensive exercise to convert it or somehow change
Well,
it?
there are processes and tools that can help you maneuver that data, but they all require time and energy, and they all require somebody to say that's appropriate or not. And so that just takes time. Remember, we produced data because we needed to for 30 years. Now we're trying to organize that data with meaningful tools for pretty much the first time. So it's sort of like going into that part of your garage that you never went into, and then finding things you didn't think, but you shouldn't throw it out just yet. So then you
Sure.
have to decide what you're going to do with it.
And in your discussions with agencies, what's your sense of how mature they are with respect to having a data strategy that can enable cloud and, more important, the analysis that they're ultimately after?
I think it varies by agency, Tom. Some have actually given it a great deal of thought. They are not resourced to deliver the end state, but it's a journey. This is a journey to continue to go back and look at legacy data, make those determinations, keep or do something else with, and then figure out, okay, now that I've decided I need it, figure out what I have to do to it to keep it into that modern compute storage format for cloud. So I think that there's a varied approach to this path. And I think that this will be a journey for the next 10 years for the agencies to move forward. And by that time, we will be on to the next storage compute format as well. And we'll just take advantage of that as we see it.
And just as an aside question, should the data that you decide does not need to be part of your operational analysis and cloud strategy, what do you do with it? Can it be stored in the cloud at some low cost way in, say, a format that maybe not be quickly retrievable, but it's not in your data center, which you might want to close?
Yeah, I think that's a case by case basis, Tom. You can't just say, hey, we can just move it or just put it somewhere and just give me the low grade storage. That's not how it works. There are things that are still on tapes. There's still things on media that doesn't exist today. So nobody touch it. It's running today. So they have to just decide piecemeal how they want to approach moving that into the forward into the modern environment.
And final question, who should be on the team for developing that holistic data strategy?
Well, most importantly, having come from the Pentagon, the user, right? Somebody who actually uses this data has to stare at what are the requirements in order for me to do my job and render decisions with this data. Second thing is obviously you have the data officer, the data architecture guys, the CIO, and the CISO, because it's not going to be any good if you don't trust it, right? So it has to be secure, it has to be in a place where it's accessible, and it has to be affordable. So now you're going to wrap around your CFO types to make sure that we actually are affording the data that we've determined we're going to keep ad infinitum. And there are strategies out there to decide how long do I hold on to something. NARA puts out those records rules for us, but there's a lot of people that have to play, and that's that coherent data process of moving to the cloud.
I'd like to thank today's guest, Rob Carey. He is president of Cloudera Government Solutions. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. You've been listening to Federal News Network. Let's now rejoin the studio for more on the DoD Cloud Exchange.